Welcome to this panel about climate security as national security. My name is Hakala. I'm a leading researcher at FIIA, and I work on climate security, surprisingly, environmental security and the geopolitics of climate change. And it is my pleasure to be moderating this panel, which I think, first of all, thank you everyone who has elected to come and listen to this one. I think that we are talking about some very existential questions, in fact. And I have the pleasure to have two speakers who are very well positioned to be talking about this very topic with me. We'll have a sort of hopefully very kind of intimate and in detail discussion on these topics. So with me today here I have Tuija Karanko, who is the Secretary General of the Finnish Defence and Aerospace Industries, FIIA, which represents Finnish companies with defense, aerospace and security. And Ms. Karanko has previously had a long career with the Finnish public administration, for example, with the defense forces. And she is also the first vice chair of the NATO Industrial Advisory Group. And then we have Damien, who is a previous UK diplomat and military officer, but he also has he's a chartered environmentalist, an IEMA fellow, and an alumni of Cambridge University Sustainable Business Program there. And he works currently with consulting firms and extensively has networked across Europe and the US and UK with different organizations helping especially the sort of military to be more sustainable. I guess we'll hear more about that in a moment. So as you can see, two excellent experts on the topic. I thought that I will give you a very short introduction to this theme, because I assume that not necessarily everyone is an expert on climate security, and this is maybe a topic that I would argue is discussed increasingly, but potentially not enough, and we don't always necessarily recognize all the impacts and reasons why this is an important topic. So I thought that I would start by saying exactly that climate change is recognized as a security issue, not only because of the direct threats that we see, for example, storms and floods. I think we've, even in the recent weeks, we've witnessed the implications in Europe that have followed from extensive flooding, the risks and implications to infrastructure and to human lives. And these are clearly on the increase as a result of climate change. But in addition to that, we also have cascading risks, which are where the environmental impact is somehow connected with or combined with all kinds of political and economic factors. So these could be supply chain disruptions, forced migration, or geopolitical tensions, for example. This summer also we had extensive drought around the Panama Canal region, and as a result there were extensive disruptions to the traffic through the canal, which of course has implications on world trade and could hinder our ability to get all kinds of critical materials. And then in addition to that, I would argue that we also have transition impacts, which are the implications of mitigating climate change. As urgent as that is, it also has some sort of creates some sort of risks to our societies and to our people around the world. For example, increasing geopolitical tensions as a result of the sort of very fossil fuel intensive states having to somehow adapt to the new situations, or increasing inequalities or sensed inequalities between different population groups within societies. And these three different sorts of impacts or risks, I would say, are also an issue for defense forces or armed forces, at least for three reasons. And I'm sorry to be so stuck with the number 3, but first of all, of course, armed forces, just like any actor in the society, needs to adapt to the impacts of climate change. For example, the rising sea level or, again, these storms and floods might also risk the critical infrastructure of armed forces. But then I would also argue that armed forces also need to be aware of the sustainability transition, so the mitigation of climate change that is already unfolding and which is taking place regardless of what the armed forces kind of think about it, I would say. So it would be a risk for armed forces to rely, for example, on fuels that are becoming obsolete as a result of the sustainability transition. And they need to be, in that sense, keep up with the transition themselves in order to adapt to that change as well. And then third, I think it can also be argued that the defense forces need to be somehow a part of the transition. We have maybe traditionally felt that armed forces are exempt somehow, or at least to some extent exempt from emission cuts, and they are, for example, not a part of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And this, I think, is very justified in the sense that they do have a very critical role in securing the security of societies and of nations. But on the other hand, you could also argue that they also have a sort of a responsibility as one actor in the society to ensure a kind of a sustainable future for us, also in the sense of mitigating climate change. So there are many challenges, in other words, for defense forces and for us, maybe also in discussing these topics. So maybe I'll start the actual panel with the first question going to Damien, because I know that you have been working with defense and environmental issues for a long time, and especially you've also discuss not only climate change, but also the other environmental problems that we have, especially biodiversity loss and maybe also pollution issues. So could you, maybe as a kind of adding up to the risks that I already mentioned, could you give some examples about how biodiversity loss, for example, is also an issue for the defense forces?
Okay, well, thank you, Emma. And the first thing I'd like to do is pick up on a couple of things you said, if I might. And I think there is a debate about how widely recognised this issue actually is. And some of us live in bubbles where we assume everybody outside the bubble actually understands what we do implicitly. But I've been engaged, as I was saying to General Hodges at lunchtime, since this issue, since 1992. And so I've watched the armed forces, and from my own nation, the UK, and from many other nations, and how they have approached this issue. And I would give a real qualification to the widely recognised piece here. Yes, we now have a NATO Centre of Excellence being established in Montreal, but the times keep slipping on that, and arguably that's far too late. And yes, some countries, and I'll refer to the UK as with some examples over our conversation, is doing quite well, although not as well as it should do. But I would argue that most nations, and certainly outside the security communities, don't really get the link, and they don't get the urgency that we need to speed up. So whatever it is we're doing now, we need to do it better. And so, but to the link, I hope they won't mind me saying, but I sat with someone at dinner last night who's a journalist, and they said, they write about security and they write about climate, but they've never seen the two being written about in the same context. And that was a really helpful example. So I hope I'll be forgiven for sharing that example. And I would recommend an article that was in The Guardian on the 19th of September which I picked out because it plays exactly to the point of this discussion. It's by Anatol Lievin, who's a professor at King's College London. I wouldn't necessarily agree with all his conclusions, but he says, I've studied geopolitics, which was a word you used just now, all my life. Climate breakdown is a bigger threat than China and Russia. And I think that's really important to say because we've been talking not so much about China, but a lot about Russia. And to that, and to I think probably the core of what we're talking about today, he writes, an observer would expect that the entire external policy of the UK and other Western European states would be devoted to fostering international cooperation and action to limit the climate breakdown and mitigate its consequences. However, nothing of the sort has occurred despite repeated statements that the climate crisis is an existential threat. And I spend most of my time arguing that it's not just an existential threat, but it's the preeminent one there. But to your specific question, which I haven't answered yet, really good being here over the last 24 hours. I've been saying to everybody what I'm talking about, and what's been really impressive is the level of knowledge. And actually, they gave all of the examples that you'd want to come out in this answer, probably. So an obvious one is perhaps climate migration. A number of people touched on impacts on military capability, fuel, lack of standardization being good examples. Energy is another obvious one, and I'm really optimistic about some of the opportunities for defence on that front. And then food and water, which get thought about much less often than they should. And infrastructure, as an example. And I was sharing with General Ben just now a previous conversation 10 years ago with the commanding general in Alaska, who said, climate change is real, I've seen it with my own eyes. And in his job, he flew over Alaska every day, and he had seen the permafrost that was melting, the roads being disrupted, the oil pipes breaking, and so on. So it's always good to get examples from other people. And back to the bubble, this room and this community is very well educated to that. I would add some of the other points that have been made from the president down, always stand on the shoulders of others. And the debate about whether it's total or comprehensive defence, a key point that for me that came out of it was a recognition, whatever you call it, that it's a whole society activity. And that's something that, particularly as our military and our military capabilities get ever smaller, we depend ever more on the whole of society to make things work. Climate change, many of you will be aware of this, requires adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. Those are really good things to hang it on, and they're all a bit different. And I would argue that so does national security. So if climate security requires all three, so does national security. And I would say, if you think back to what's been said over the last 18 hours, that's been coming out loud and clear, albeit framed in a different context. I wrote down the word foundations here because I think, again, it's come out loud and clear that it's for a well-found society is what you need in order to go forward. Mm-hmm. Climate change is a threat to the very fabric and foundation of society. If we're to deal with shocks, we need a society that's cohesive and competent and can provide at least all the basics to itself. If you haven't got that, you're doomed. And I would describe these other crises as temporary, and it was said that all wars end, but then it was also said that new ones begin. But they're all temporary crises. A thing to take away, I'd say, from this session, if you hadn't clocked it already, is this crisis is not going away. It's with us for ours, our children's and our grandchildren's lives. It's going to get worse. It's going to combine with a whole bunch of other things that's called the polycrisis, whether that's population growth, whether it's the increased standards of living that people demand, whether it's shortage of critical resources. Fresh water is only 3% of the world's water, and what are we doing? We're polluting it and ruining it. So there's an example. And finally, biodiversity. I was really glad you used that word actually, because this is an area that I think for me is fascinating and troubling beyond the climate change thing. All the conversations I've had with people have said that that climate change is for them recognised from a risk security perspective, almost nobody gets the difference between that and biodiversity and nature loss. So, for example, next month I'm going to COP16 in Colombia, and that is the Biodiversity and Nature COP. Most people aren't even aware there's two separate ones. But having been at COP15, I was accused sometimes by people of being, oh, you're one of these climate people. They're not actually working together, so they're competing for the same resources, same funding, to deal with actually quite sometimes different issues and with solutions that work for one but don't work for the other. So we've got to bring all that together, and there's a huge piece of work, and I've yet to see any engagement with security around the whole field of biodiversity and nature. And I'll finish with a quote. I know that's been a very long answer, but I promise it'll be the longest. A very wise Kenyan woman, the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, Wangari Maathai, she said, "Nature is very unforgiving. If you destroy nature, it will destroy you." And to come back to the wider context of the conversations we've been having here, I would say that we could perhaps be accused of arrogance here in the anthropocentric perspective we've taken. We only seem to get our heads around threats from other humans. And I think we need to move beyond that and see the bigger picture.
Thank you, Damien. That's a very good answer, and I think that you also rightly maybe alluded to the fact that maybe sometimes, especially I think for me, being slightly in this sort of climate bubble, it's maybe easy to forget that in some other circles these questions are not really addressed so much. So actually, you, Tuija, coming from the defense industry, I would maybe ask a kind of a naive and basic question. How do these topics like climate change sort of feature in your work?
Well, thank you, Emma, and first of all, thank you for having me here. This is actually one of those topics that I'm very passionate about, and I'd like to start by sort of my own analysis. Maybe Damien can sort of comment or has other views, but I see this from the industry's perspective. First of all, traditional military perspective is very close to our perspective, and it's what you just said, that climate change is a threat multiplier in many ways. But then when I think of the industry, and once when I was talking about this, I was said that defense industry and sustainability are contradictions in terms. And I argue very much against that. And if I think of sort of where we've been and where we've gone through, defense industry, be there then exemptions for the defense forces or not, but defense industry is industry. They use energy, they use water, they pollute, and whenever that sort of started that companies in general need to pay attention to this. Was it then in the 1970s, moreover in the 80s? That was also the case of the defense industry. So the production and everything involved was done as best as we could to mitigate any risks for the climate, and we didn't talk about climate change then, but for the climate change. So it started sort of from the civilian regulation, but then also from the understanding that you want to be cost efficient as a company. So you want to start using circular economy, recycling, and all of that. So that's like a 50-year-old thing. Nothing new there, and with the defense industry not having any exemptions on that. So part of that. Then in the 1990s, the governments and the military started to realize this maybe threat scenario and all of that, and maybe they had for the first time after the fall of the wall sort of time and resources to think about these issues. But their point of view was emissions, energy, and fuel. And not because, and this is, I know I'm being very provocative, and I can't even say that this is Chatham House because it's streamed, but I'm going to say this anyway. I claim that their point of view was not from the perspective that this is the right thing to do. The military thought of this as a risk for the logistical chains. And of course, they needed to be cost efficient. So you started to looking at your energy supply and what to do with that. But it was very much in the 1990s onwards, and still actually is very much from the logistics and from the energy consumption, because that's, of course, if you want to minimize your emissions, that's where you get the most resources from. But it hasn't been until the last 10 or so years that we've seen this rising understanding that competing or mitigating climate risks has very strong consequences for military capabilities. And this goes through all domains, including the cyber domain. And this, to me, and this is the part that I'm so passionate about, and there hasn't been very much studies on this. And when I compare the work that I see done within the EU, it's about legislation and sort of doing sort of trying to mitigate the risks that way. And then every now and then there is an exemption for defense. And when I look at NATO, I see that we are more concerned and we want to study the consequences on the military capabilities. And of course, then we as industry want to see what does it bring. And is that something, when I think of the Finnish industry, is that something where we could have the competitive edge that we could work with? So that is sort of my perspective, and I think I stop there and then I'll leave room for more.
Yeah, we'll get into that in more detail, hopefully. Maybe sort of related to that, I know that, Damien, you've been working with militaries and defense force actors and kind of traditional security actors with exactly these sort of decarbonization efforts. So what is your experience, how to motivate and how to justify to these defense actors how and why they should be doing this?
I could probably think of a dozen different armed forces that I've had engagement with, and the answer would be they're all different. And of course, all militaries reflect their national culture, and they reflect the politics of the day as well. And the people you meet tend to be the people who are having careers, who are ambitious, so there's also that to factor in as well. But what I would say is, until very recently, most, including the UK, and I know this isn't Chatham House rules, but I'm a civvy now, so I can say that, have not been leaning in. Yeah, they've not been leaning in at all. And I have been given examples such as, this is not our lane. I've been pretty much cut dead, and particularly when I was serving in uniform, where people are like, what kind of military officer are you if you're into all this green shit? Yeah. But probably the most depressing one was only last year, and it was a I won't say what country, but it was a diplomat in Vienna where I live, a defense attaché, who, because of Ukraine, said, we need to leave this for our children. And that you got to think about that. You know, it's too late if you leave it for our children. And so the fact that you've got, you know, really experienced defense diplomats who are saying, this is not our business, is so there's been an apartness. And for example, at COP21 in Paris, it was explicit that there was to be no military or security engagement with the conference whatsoever. And there were good reasons for that, because many nations in the world are hostile to military actors, because many of them are malign, and that's reasonable. And the fear is that by bringing the security inside the tent, is that you drive away the majority of the other actors that you need in the tent, because they won't have anything to do with it. So that's interesting. So to give a personal example, the things that I've done, I've had to do by stealth. And the Cambridge programme you mentioned, it taught us the good old mantra, people, planet, profit, the triple bottom line benefits to doing stuff. So having been funded to go and do this very expensive course, I then go back to my general. I've got a really good idea to do something that's sustainable, but I realise I've got to pitch it to them without talking about planet. He gets people because he's a military officer, so he at least believes that he cares about all his people. He's an ambitious general, so it's all about driving down costs, so there's profit. As soon as I'd mentioned planet, he would have thrown me out of the room. It would undermine the rest of the argument. So in the end, we had a very successful project. It saved millions off our budget. I think it may still be going on today for a variety of reasons, but nowhere has that general been able to exploit the benefits of what he was doing for the planet. I mean, that should be seen as a positive. It cost him I mean, look at it from a business perspective. It costs you nothing. You get great kudos for it. Boom. So there's a winner. So UK and others are starting to move forward. An example I give is COP26, where the first military event took place. It was a side event. It was led by the Munich Security Conference. People like Jens Stoltenberg and Ben Wallace and various other defence ministers were in the tent, physically in the room there. But it happened with a very low profile because it was a bit of a test, toe in the water to see whether we could do it. And the view was the UK must not lead this because it would be seen as, domineering and all the rest of it. And the US, of course, not for the same reasons, but that worked. COP26 instigated in UK defence actually a massive move forward. Boris Johnson insisted that all government departments review their own impacts. General Carter, who was then Chief of Defence, said he was appalled to learn that UK defence is 50% of central government emissions, but he was determined to do something about it. And to be fair to him, he got a 3-star, Richard Nugent, to do a strategic review. There's now a 2-star directorate, and the frontline commands are also looking at all this kind of thing. And actually, the UK, for example, is embracing circularity. So they're now designing new warships along circular principles. So there's an example of industry and the military working together really well. It's all barcoded, and they know at the end of life what to do with each piece from the ship. They have got carbon negative training facilities that are being built now that actually generate more energy than they consume. So these are good news stories, and these are ones that we can share with others, because guess what? They also save you money over the long term. I had other things to say. I should probably not fill all the time though. But in conclusion, I would say it's all to play for. I am positive about this. And what I would say, having done some work looking at military procurement for the UK Cabinet Office, is prima facie, there was nothing to stop military procurement adopting a multi-capital approach where you look at, as well as produced capital, i.e. money, you're looking at human, social and natural capital as well. And you're weighting all those when you're giving out the contracts, and you're producing whole of society benefits, going back to the point about this is whole of society business. And military people are really adaptable. By nature a conservative organisation and culture, if you told them, for example, to sexuality or gender issues, they bump their gums for the first year or 2 years, and the old guys do, then you completely internalise it. It's just normal part of your culture. I'd give that as an example of how they'll adapt. And for the private sector, having talked in that study for the Cabinet Office to some major defence contractors in the UK, who were already subject to waiting for social capital anyway in their government bids, they go, you just need to be clear with us what you want us to deliver, and we will then compete. Yeah. So play to your point. I'll stop there.
Yeah. If I could sort of just comment on that, and I think it's very good that you touched upon sort of the money issue, because that, of course, as we all know, is a very good incentive. And indeed, the procurements. I don't know how well aware you are about how to develop military capabilities, defense systems, but in general, they are not produced for stock. It's not something that you would have a catalog, and then you would say that, this is what we have, and how many would you like? But you sort of, it goes the other way around. You work with the customer, and there is a customer requirement, and you very often and mostly build for that requirement, meaning that if the government, if the customer does not request for you to be carbon neutral or to for your materials to have the least effect on climate change or whatever. You don't do it because it's expensive, and it would be on your own cost. Your system would be more expensive than that of your competitors, and you will lose. So I think sort of the money is an incentive, but the industry does need the signal from the customer. Another thing what I sort of missed to point out in my opening is the fact that maybe many in the room and behind the screen, sort of you think of defense industry as being this huge industry with massive volumes of production. But if we think of vehicles, for instance, and compare the production of military vehicles into that of civilian automotive industry, our volumes are very small. And which means, and when we work in a global networked economy, we share many of the same sub-suppliers as your regular civilian car manufacturers would, which means that they will comply with any regulation there is to sort of work for the environment, which means that we do too. So it's not just a question of the large OEMs within the defense industry, original equipment manufacturers, but it is the supply chain that is coming and is complying with all these regulations. And then I come back to my point, who is making sure that the regulations for the supply chain and for the for the prime contractors, that it produces the military capability required.
That's a good point, and I was actually going to ask you a bit about this, because I think you've said before in some interview that ESG, so these sort of sustainability kind of regulations or requirements, or what do you call them?
A luxury.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that they are a luxury, that is only possible when national security is ensured through defense capability, obviously. But do you think that there is a chance that, I think you sort of alluded to that previously, but that in a way these wouldn't be sort of kind of directives coming from the outside to the industry, but actually could be an opportunity for the defense industry to somehow be more exactly competitive, but at the same time more sustainable? How do you think that we could somehow get there? And actually, I would also add to that question, because I think in the previous panel there was discussion about how obviously one problem for defense industry is that it's still kind of seen as not sort of favorable investment and so on. So do you think that there could be a kind of a strategic incentive for defense industry to pay more attention to the sustainability side?
Well, first of all, I think the defense industry and the customer, they need to go hand in hand on this, as I explained about the development of military capabilities. And there, I think we can find the competitive edge, so that you look hand in hand. I mean, we've seen many strategies and some communique from a NATO or from EU where it says that we will sort of cut our emissions by this and that, and we will take mitigating climate change into our procurement principles. What does that mean? So I think we need to work hand in hand and see what that means. And I would say that this is where the industry is at least a few steps sort of further down that road than what the customers are. But I think this is something that we need to do together, and this is actually something that we with the Finnish MOD have been talking about, that let's study this together. So I think that is what is needed, both sort of customer and then the provider. As to the ESG criteria, I sort of dislike the idea that this would be a greenwashing the defense industry. I strongly feel that it isn't. I think this is a must, and we understand that must. And this is what we do. Defense industry traditionally is very responsible, and we work for the sustainable societies and our sustainable future.
All right. I think we have to open the discussion to the audience questions soon. Well, maybe I'll do it now because I can see that there are some questions. So at least in the back, I saw one hand. Yes.
Thank you very much. I abuse the right to take the floor and not pose a question, but to make a comment. My name is Petteri Vuorenmäki. I'm Finland's Arctic ambassador. Obviously, I would agree with the statement that the climate change poses an existential threat. And what we need to bear in mind is that the Arctic, the circumpolar Arctic, is at the forefront of that threat and challenge. The resources are become more accessible, the sea lanes open, the permafrost thaws, and much of the structure, both civilian and military, it rests on permafrost. All of this means that there will be much more focus, attention, and much more traffic, both civilian and military. And therefore, I think we all need to bear in mind that in the Arctic region, the climate change is the biggest existential threat. And that's why the work of, for example, the Arctic Council is more important than ever before. That was a comment, not a question. Thank you.
Could I comment to that?
Thank you. Yes, please.
I think that's a very valid point. And when I think of the Finnish defense forces and defense industry, and we think of maneuverability in the Arctic, all of this poses requirements for the mobility, for the different types of vehicles, for the maintenance, repair, and overhaul, because you will need more of that. It is becoming more difficult to also to hide, but yet you need to keep on the move. So all of that, when I think of military capabilities, has effect on what type of sheltering and protection do you need, what type of movements do you need, what type of soldier equipment do you need. And this is where we, as said, need to walk hand in hand. I mean, we're talking about material technology, we're talking about energy technology, we're talking about a lot of things here.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. If we don't have any immediate more questions right now, I would maybe ask both of you about the role of NATO, which of course is a huge thing in Finland at the moment because of our recent membership. But NATO has also been a very sort of vocal actor on climate security and has been also sort of calling for these assessments on climate risks, but then also pointing out the need of defense forces to green their activities. So what do you think, both of you, first of all, about if you're familiar with what NATO is doing on this front, and what kind of an impact do you think that it will have at the national level on the defense forces? Will it somehow oblige them to act more on these issues? Maybe we'll start with Damien.
Well, I'm outside the bubble now, so I can't really comment confidently on what's been happening the last couple of years. But I was talking to someone at the dinner last night. It was a Norwegian, and he was talking about fuel, to give this as an example, and you know the lack of standardisation if we move to ethanol or ammonia and so on. And to which I said, well, the answer is simple. We've always had NATO standards, and we just need to bring in NATO standards and ensure interoperability. So I don't think that's changed. But what we absolutely do need to do is go forward together as an alliance, you know, hand in hand. I know there are working groups. So, for example, I was the DA. I covered Slovenia as part of my remit, and there was a really great, crazy colonel down there who was working with hydrogen generation, and he wanted to use military land, and in most countries, one of the major landowners is the military, to generate green, clean electricity, and then use hydrogen fuel for second, third, and fourth line military vehicles, and what an exciting idea! And so you can already meet quite a lot of your military requirement through doing that. So you've got to work together. You've got to have standards, and to pick up on the point about industry as well. I mean, you've used the word competition more than once, which absolutely get. But there is also then the pre-competitive space as well. And if you're designing CD players or VHS versus Betamax, you need industry standardization. So there needs to be also a place, and I look to you whether it's there or not, where it's explicit just how you bring about some common standards amongst all your friends, allies, and non-adversaries. And there's even, in terms of that, a question which I have as an open question, I don't know the answer to, is absolutely how far do you share these good solutions, even with your enemies, question mark? Because actually, ultimately, if we're coming back to adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, it's if for one to win, all have to win. Yeah. So do we share, I don't know, clean energy with potential or actual adversaries, if it means that they are cleaner and then our air and our temperature and our sea levels are better? I don't know the answer. That's open-ended.
Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the standards, because I think that is what NATO is doing and has been doing and is known for, and that is of utmost importance. As to the work within NATO, I'm really happy to learn, and I'm learning all the time more and more, that this capability aspect is very, very much present. There is an action plan, but it's proposals to the governments, to the NATO nations. They don't have to comply, and of course, every nation is sort of the starting point. The culture is different, so we will see. But the capability part is there. What has been found, however, within different NATO documents is that with the technology we have today, it is very challenging, if not even impossible, to have the required level of capabilities you need, while if we do not use this not so green energy forms or not so green materials and systems as we have today. So it's not a pessimistic view, but it's not very optimistic either. So it will take time before we reach a zero emissions when it comes to military capabilities, or can even minimize them drastically.
Can I just add to that? And so I mentioned the COP26 debate. Ben Wallace, then UK Defence Secretary, and he was in post for a really long time, and he knew his stuff and was ex-military. He said in front of Jens Stoltenberg and others, he said, I spend about, to translate it to euros, about 25 billion euros a year on buying kit. Once I buy that kit, I have to use it for 30 to 40 years.
Yeah.
I'm not a first mover, but I can be a fast follower. But you have to recognize, and I think this builds on your point, you have to recognize that once you've got something, in order for the taxpayer to get the return on the investment, you've got to use it for a while. So the so what is, you want to make sure that whatever it is you're paying for is the absolute latest and best, or least bad, perhaps would be a term to use.
Yeah.
Good points. We are almost out of time, but there is one question in the middle here, and actually Tuija as well. So if we could have very short, brief questions, and then quick answers to them.
Hi there. My name is Greg Pollock, and I work in the Pentagon. I'm the principal director in the Office of Arctic and Global Resilience Policy, and I think we've been making a good deal of progress in the U.S. Department of Defense in terms of mainstreaming these issues of climate security and what the energy transition is going to mean for defense operations around the world. That said, I think there's a great deal more work to do. To my question, we heard in the earlier panels around defense industry that there is a sense that there are trade-offs right now between welfare and warfare. And these are the very real questions facing politicians in Europe and around the world. I guess my question to you would be, do you see a way to navigate that sort of sense or perception that there is a trade-off to be made between the green energy transition and the necessary kind of armaments acquisition happening right now, particularly with respect to the conflict in Ukraine. And then my second, I guess, hope for some feedback is around, how do we talk about the importance of climate security, which, as you say, to those of us living in this bubble is quite obvious, but in contexts in which issues of climate change remain still quite politically polarized, as remains the case in meaningful degree in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we still have time for Tuija to quickly ask her question.
You need to write them down. I didn't even bring a piece.
Okay, thank you. Maybe this is not a good last question since it's so elementary and shows that I don't know much about the topic, but I still want to use this opportunity. Can you still explain about the emissions of defense industry, that how much is there actually that we can do in terms of the different phases of the industry? How much can we actually change things in this industry to decrease the emissions? Is it just something minor, or can we actually do something groundbreaking there? And then if not, do the compensation, does it actually work that these industries then compensate for the emissions? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So trade-offs and actual potential to cut.
I wrote them down, so if I go first.
You go first, and then I
why
try
don't
to...
we can flip-flop.
Yeah.
So question 1, right? Welfare versus warfare. I always stand on the shoulders of giants. I referred to a previous speaker. If there is a need, there are means, and that was the CEO of Patria. It's not a question of can you afford to. The question is, can you afford not to? So the answer is that you've got to do all of this, and actually there's a net benefit. If you get this right, you have less warfare. And then you have more money for welfare. Yeah. And I've been alive to this issue since 1992, and I've been watching those curves of what we need to do in terms of how quickly we need to get the emissions since 1992. And you know what? They just get steeper and steeper. Of course, we should have started all this decades ago, but we didn't. But that doesn't mean, say, now it's too late, it's too difficult. Welfare versus warfare.
Yeah, that was very well done, because I would have said the same. I'm gonna reply to the last question. I think there are two things here. One of them is production of something, and then the next thing is, okay, what does this system? What does it do? What does it consume? How does it run? And within production side, we've done a lot. We've complied with everything there is. And as technology develops, materials develops, we are doing a lot. So we are not anywhere else where the civilian industry wouldn't be. So exactly there. Then when we go to the systems, and this is where we go to the customer again, what is it that they are willing to pay for? We can think about SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, or sustainable fuels, but at this moment, they do not necessarily work for the engines that are needed to move around a battle tank or an armored carrier. So, and with the long life cycle of these systems, 50, 60 years even, this is a challenge. But on the production side, we are doing it, but then the system itself can pose a challenge with its long life cycle and with the customer requirements.
And come in on the back of that third point there, I quoted 50% of central government emissions in the UK were defence. That is a massive opportunity to do something better. It's a massive opportunity for a government department to go to the centre and say, if you want me to hit your targets, I'm half the answer. Give me money. I'd also build on the point there about industry, and I would say everybody gets focused on tanks and planes and so on, and obviously they're a huge piece of the pie. But what about everything else? The built environment, infrastructure, food, clothing, all of these other areas are all areas that you can massively nibble against. Training, how you train people, and think there are solutions like simulation that are getting better and more useful. So you can make a massive dent in it there as well. But too often people will say, you want to throw away our tanks, you know? And a point I would make as an ex-military guy, which I think needs to be made in a climate security point, is I don't think there's anyone in the room here who's talking about having a military you plan on coming second in a battle or a war. Absolutely not. And that's one of the brickbats that gets thrown at anyone who talks about climate security. You want us to lose. No. I've been in 6 operational theatres. I've been in combat theatres. No, not suggesting that for a minute, but it's how do you make sure you do that whilst also seizing the opportunities to get operational and tactical advantage by doing things differently. And then the final one on polarisation, go back to your second one, that's social media, you needed to be at some of the other lunchtime sessions on that, I guess. But I once asked Lord Stern this question, who wrote the Stern Review on the economics of climate change, and he said, facts, dear boy, facts. I once then asked Chris Goodall, who was big on circular economy and wrote a number of books from Oxford, the same question. He said, no, that's rubbish, it's storytelling. What I've concluded from those two much wiser men than I is actually you've got to find the point of reference that works for that person. And whether it's religion, whether it's grandchildren, whether it's being rich, you've got each to avoid the polarization, you've clearly got to counter all of the spin and all the rest of it. But you've then got to find in each and every conversation, I try to do this with every time I talk to different people, work out how can I have a constructive conversation so they don't just shut down. Is you've got to absolutely do that to avoid polarization, but good luck in the US on that one.
Well, I'd like to sort of just add on to that, and this is also something that you already said, and that is people, which is maybe still, with all the technology you have, with all the systems you have, for any military, and especially for Western military, it's the people. Yeah. And that's the important one, and that as a commander, that is the asset that you need to take care of. Because with that, you get the political acceptance, even if you don't care about the individuals. I would utilize that fact. Not the money so much, but the people, the most valuable asset that you have.
That's a very good point. Just to clear up, actually, I just got some new added minutes to my countdown clock here, so it looks like we're not quite as finished as it looked. I hope this is not some kind of a symbolic reminder that the humanity is on borrowed time or something like that, but we're happy about this, these extra minutes. I think I saw some hands in the back, so yes, please, we have one more question at least.
Hello, Federica Prandin from FIIA. So my question touches upon the people, but on a more broader scale. So when we think about preparedness and also the distribution of responsibility and first response to extreme climate events as a result of climate change, how do you see this distribution of responsibility between military and civilian institutions? This has been a huge debate within NATO itself. And if we need to strengthen civilian institutions, then what would be the role of the military there?
That's a good question. Maybe also keeping in mind the Finnish model of comprehensive security that we have been talking about, where the sort of civilian sector does have a role also in security or providing security. Which one of you would like to start?
So the military role in providing security with extreme events?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's already happening all over the world. I live in Austria, and one of the things they're really good at there is Schutz und Hilfe, which is they protect and support. And, their military are really good at that. But importantly, what they're good at, and same in Switzerland, which was another one of my countries, they integrate locally, they integrate with the police, fire, health. They all know each other. They all drink at the same Stammtisch in the Kneipe. So there's absolutely a role there. That's a home role. How you then project that to other places. The first operation time NATO deployed was actually to Pakistan for doing disaster relief. So there is precedence there. And that was under, was it first non-Article 5 deployment. So that happens. There's a huge role there. One of the things we might have talked about, we had hoped to talk about if there was more time, was about the whole training and awareness and all the rest of it, which we clearly don't have time for. But there's huge implications as a takeaway from this event for how we train our boys and girls who are going to be the next generation. How we recruit them is another issue, given other factors. But how do we train them, not just in terms of the hard skills, but also in some of the values and moral dimensions in terms of some of the things we might ask them to do? And think of climate migration as the obvious example of, what do you do when the horde is coming at you?
And I think there are two aspects here. One of them is what you just described, sort of when something has already hit the fan, and then you have the military there to to deal with the situation. But of course, then the other aspect is to what should you be doing from the begin with. And there, I sort of do not too much support the idea that you would have that the military needs to do this bit and then the civilian world, the rest of us, needs to do this bit. I think we're all in it together, and if we start looking at somebody else that they need to do more, we at the same time forget that what is it that we are doing, our individual choices and way of consuming and the way we work. So therefore, I would like to point out that we're all in this together.
And I guess in the case of climate change, very clearly we are somehow on the same planet, so we are on the same boat. We are going to have to wrap up quite soon, but I will maybe ask one last final question about, I think we have sort of addressed some aspects of this before, but there is right now, and as we have maybe talked in previous sessions as well, there is this sort of strong kind of re-emergence of the defense industry and the need to arm ourselves is very apparent as a result of the Russian attack on Ukraine. And there is also talk about industrial policy, especially in the EU, in somehow kind of supporting this re-emerging role of the defense industry. But do you see that this could somehow be combined, or could it provide opportunities for also ensuring that the defense industry is sustainable also in the future? Tuija first.
Yes, I do see, but I think the industry is in a dilemma at this moment, and Russians' aggression in Ukraine and Russians' war in Ukraine has resulted to the fact that the traditional stockpiles and the traditional warfare, the systems that, as I said, they can be decades old. We need to sort of bring in the commodities, bring in the ammunition, maintain the systems, and sort of have ready-made solutions that are already there and fill in the stocks and support Ukraine. So we're talking about very traditional defense equipment, and this is what very often seems to get the attention and the funding. But then when we are talking about the green transition and battling climate change, we are looking into the future and into what we were doing prior to the war. And this is what I always bring out to the table, is that these two are not sort of, we need the both. So you cannot just concentrate on the immediate needs, that you also need to focus on research, development and innovation for the future, and green transition is a major, major part of that.
Exactly, thank you. Damien.
Great, and use some of the key words I would use, innovation being one of them. And one of the things that worries me is that we are refocusing back on just building more tanks, which we will then need to run for 40 years. The world will transition away from fossil fuel. 1% of the fuel consumed by the world is military. What will that do to the price of a gallon of gas for your tank? And what will the supply lines be like for that? So we've got to do something, otherwise you end up with a whole raft of stranded assets that have been a complete malinvestment. And the exciting thing, and to be positive at the end, the opportunity is often these times, you know, whether it's the climate change or the war, you know, all the other things going on at the moment, throw up tremendous opportunities to come up with better ways of being and better ways of living. I really like what General Mike said before lunch when he talked about agility, speed, affordability, partnership. I think all of that plays to what we're talking about in innovation. It's about the need to share as well, not just the need to protect. You know, and so I think, you know, out of a fairly grim scenario that we've been hearing about for the last day, there are some longer-term positives that we can be found.
I agree.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now we have truly run out of time. But thank you so much for our excellent panelists, and thank you also for all of your great questions, and hopefully the discussion will continue in some form. Thank you.
Thank you.